welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Maria and today's video is going to be my February reading wrap up. So if you've watched my past few videos, you may know that I did have a bit of a slumpy month in February, but if you look on paper, you wouldn't actually know it. I feel like the stats actually look like I had a pretty good reading month, and I did. I mean, it was nothing to do with the books, nothing to do with the books not being good or anything like that. It was definitely a me problem. I think I was just a little bit burnt out, a little bit tired. I probably should have just given myself a break from reading, but I don't really have any other hobbies, so wasn't really anything else I could do. But yeah, I think overall, I think the month went really well. I ended up reading 11 books, which again, even though I was in a slump, I think that's really good. I did try to start a few and kind of soft DNF them when I got about maybe 20 to 30% in. Again, nothing reflecting on the books, it was just how I was feeling, so I probably could have read more books if I wasn't feeling that way, because at the start of the month I thought I was really starting off really strong, I was doing really well in my TBR, but once I hit mid-Feb, just that all kind of went by the wayside. But regardless, as I say, I ended up reading 11 books. The average rating was actually 4.1, so again, it obviously wasn't all bad. And yeah, there was actually a few books that I found in here that are kind of going to be firm favourites for me, and I'm really excited to continue in the series for those. So yeah, I'll give you all my thoughts and feelings on those, all the books that I read, how I rated them, what I felt about them, if they're books that I would recommend, and if I'll be continuing the series in them if they were a start of a series. But yeah, we've got quite a few books to get through, so without further ado, let's just get into the wrap up. Okay, so the first book I read in February was Bonesmith by Nikki Powell-Prado, and this is one that I had been anticipating for quite some time, and I'd had it on my TBR for quite a while as well, since I'd had, I think this is Fairy Loot, yes, this is the Fairy Loot edition, so absolutely love this edition. And the tagline of this kind of says it's Gideon the Ninth meets Game of Thrones, so that had me really excited because I absolutely love Gideon the Ninth. I haven't read Game of Thrones, but I have obviously watched the TV show, so again I was very intrigued to see where that fit with this, and I think loosely maybe that is quite true. I think the vibes of Gideon the Ninth are maybe here, but it definitely isn't the same type of storytelling. So if you really love Gideon the Ninth and you think you're getting the same type of storytelling in this, you won't. It is quite different. But in terms of the vibe and the world that you've got here, you may kind of see that crossover here. And I think we have quite a few kind of political families within here, so I can kind of see where that Game of Thrones comparison comes from. But in this one, we're following Ren, who has trained her whole life to become a ghost fighting warrior. And at the start of the book, she's actually participating in these trials to become one. Ends up failing and is banished to this place called the Breach to kind of be the first line of defense there. But for her family, that is quite an insult, and she's trying to regain the honor for her family after losing those trials. As part of that, she actually witnesses a prince getting kidnapped. She ends up trying to be part of the party to try and save that prince. Along the way, she meets this warrior who is from the banished lands of the Iron Kingdom, and they kind of reluctantly ally with one another, and along the way they discover some secrets that they maybe didn't know before. There's definitely a little bit of enemies to lovers in here, and I did really enjoy this. I do think that there was some predictability within it. I think some of the pacing within here was a little slow in the middle, and then at the end it kind of really sped up, and I think I would have liked it to kind of slow down at that point and maybe had a few extra pages just to explore some of the things that happened at the end. There was quite a few revelations, and I did really like this. I don't think it was 5-star, it was probably around the more 4-star region for me. I am still interested in continuing on with this series and seeing where the second book goes. This is a geology, so I might as well read the next book to see where it goes, but unfortunately it didn't seem to hit the way I would have thought it would. I was really anticipating this being 5-star, but I did still really enjoy it. I really enjoyed the storytelling. I did think it was a little bit predictable at times, but there were a few twists and turns put in there that kept me intrigued and kept me interested right until the end. So definitely one I would recommend, and one that I will be continuing the series of. But yeah, overall I think this one is around 4-star for me. And then next up, I read Quicksilver by Callie Hart, and I do have a vlog kind of reading this one, so if you do want to see kind of in-depth thoughts and feelings and reactions to that, I'll link that in the description box below. But this one, I wasn't really sure what to expect. I'd seen a lot of hype about it, I'd seen a lot of people saying they loved it, a lot of people giving it 5 stars, the best new romantasy to be published, and for me that always makes me very wary. I'm always really frightened to read it in case it's one that I'm not going to love, or if it's just not going to be the type of romantasy that I like. So I was really apprehensive jumping into this one. I had this on my Kindle when it was an indie publication. I was meant to read it for months and months and months, and then it was traditionally published, and purchased this in January, so it didn't wait too long to read it. I ended up just biting the bullet, picking this one up, and basically got FOMO. I wanted to see what the hype was about with this one, and really glad I did. This one I just think was so much fun. It was definitely a little bit cliche at times, definitely a little bit tropey, but I just think it was done in exactly the right way to keep me interested and invested in the characters and in the story. And I think there was enough of a unique storyline in here that it kept me engaged. In this one, we're following Ceres, who is part of the mortal world. You know, within her world, she believes there are no fae. She has had these powers for for quite some time, but she hasn't told anyone about them until inadvertently one day she ends up opening a gateway to the Fae realm, ends up being embroiled in this kind of centuries-long Fae conflict, and is inadvertently tied to Kingfisher, who is one of the top Fae warriors within that land. So she's trying to navigate her way through the Fae realm, through this new world, and with all these new people, and the story kind of goes from there. I think if you go into this a little bit blind, it's probably the best experience. You're kind of learning about the world through Ceres's view, and I think that the way that the author done that was really masterful, and I really felt like I was learning everything about this world with her. Didn't feel info dumpy, didn't feel like we were just being told information in a very clinical way or anything like that. I really felt like we were discovering the Fae world with her. I think it just had everything that I really like in a romantasy. I think it had some great world building, it had an intriguing magic system, we had kind of a mix of Fae and vampire in here. It's really fast paced, there was an FMC that you wanted to root for, we had a really broody MMC, and I mean, perfect combination when it comes to these romantasy tales. Really good, well developed side characters. There was one character in particular, Carrion Swift, that I cannot wait to see in the second book in this one. I felt like the romance was pretty well paced. I wouldn't say it was slow paced, but it wasn't fast paced either. I think there was a good amount of tension within there to kind of build up that relationship, and there were quite a few twists at the end that kept me on my toes. So as I say, I don't think this was anything new within this genre. I don't think this is going to be anything groundbreaking if you've read romantasy and if you're a big fan of it, but it was just done so well. It kept me interested, I wasn't bored at any time, and for that reason I ended up giving it 5 stars. It probably, if I was really to dig down, it probably is like a 4.5, but I couldn't really think of a reason to give it anything less than 5 stars, so that's what I ended up giving it on Goodreads. And then speaking of 5 stars, the next book I read, and it was in that same video, was Beartown by Frederick Backman, and I think all I can say about this book is wow. Absolutely love this. If you haven't heard of this one, it's following kind of a group of people within this small town in Sweden. It's quite a desolate town. They've kind of seen a lot of economy and things like that shift from the town in recent years, and they're quite worried about basically the town surviving because they don't have a tourist culture there. You know, no one's coming to this town and kind of building up that economy, so a lot of people are quite worried about how long this town will last. And they do have an ice hockey team who are basically on the brink of putting them back on the map because they may be able to win this kind of tournament and then entice tourists to then come back to this town and kind of, as I say, just put them back on the map and get the economy going again. Now within this town, something does happen kind of just before that match is supposed to happen, and it basically puts the town into turmoil, and a lot of what this book does is makes you question your morality. It kind of shows the effects of certain incidents on humanity and how we react to those and how we deal with those, and I just really loved the way that this approached certain social commentary, and the way that this is written is kind of through the viewpoints of several different characters. So we don't really have a main character within this. We do kind of see everything through the lens of several different characters within the town, and you know, it's not a huge book, but I felt like we really got to know those characters inside out while we were reading this. I could understand their motivations, I could almost preempt what they would do, how they would react, and I just think it was so beautifully written, and I honestly couldn't put it down. I ended up tabbing it because there were so many beautiful quotes and relatable quotes, even though people within certain situations aren't the same situation as myself in my life. There were so many quotes that I could just really relate to in here, and it was very much a character study in that way. It was an emotional roller coaster. You know, there were times that I wanted to laugh out loud, there were times I wanted to cry, there were times I was just really angry, and those were all within kind of pages of each other. And I just think his writing style is, on the face of it, quite simplistic, but it's so masterful in the way that he delivers the messages that he's trying to convey, and I just don't think I've read anything quite like this. So really intrigued to read on in this series because I believe there's 3 books within this series, and to see where the story goes for these characters and kind of the aftermath of this book. But I just think no matter what genre you usually love, I would definitely recommend picking this up because I just think on a human level you probably will connect with this in some way. But yeah, just so glad I decided to pick this up. Absolutely 5 stars. I've only read one book by Frederick Backman, but it's kind of fast going to become an auto-author for me if the rest of his works are the same as this. So really excited to read more from him and see how they compare. So the rest of the books I actually read this month were on my Kindle, so I didn't have the physical copies. Most of them were either Kindle or audiobooks because it was in and around this time, probably because I had 2 really good books, that I started to feel a little bit slumpy. But the next book I picked up was Wilde Love by Elsie Silver, and in this one we're following Ford and Rosie. So Ford is kind of this billionaire who set up like a music company or something like like that. Something happens within his record label and he ends up coming back to Rose Hill to set up kind of a more simplistic record label, wanting to kind of work with fewer artists and just make kind of something real. So he comes back to Rose Hill, and when he's there he bumps into Rosie, who is kind of his best friend's little sister. They've been friends their entire lives, basically grew up together. Rosie was kind of working in the city, but she ends up coming back home because a bit of an altercation within her job, and the story kind of goes from there. I don't really want to go into too many details with it, but essentially we're just watching their relationship kind of develop and bloom, and this is obviously kind of a brother's best friend slash childhood friends romance, and I think if you like Elsie Silver you will like this one. I did enjoy it. I thought it was quite a cute read. I really liked the dynamic between the two characters. I liked a certain device that she used to kind of help them communicate in certain ways, and yeah, I think like if you like romance you're going to enjoy this one. For me it was around a 4-star. It wasn't one of my favourites from Elsie Silver, but it was definitely a good romance, and as I say, if you like Elsie Silver you'll probably enjoy this. And I didn't mention actually this series, part of the Rose Hill series, is kind of a single dads series, so there was an element within this story where Ford basically ends up finding out that he has a child that he didn't know he had and that's part of the narrative as well. And one thing that I do think Elsie Silver does quite well is write children within books where you don't have 5-year-olds kind of giving you relationship advice. You know, I think she writes them quite age appropriately, and this was no exception. I think she done it really well, so that's all I really have to say about that one. And I did actually end up reading Wilde Eyes as well later in the month, but since I'm talking about this one I might as well throw this one in as well. And in Wilde Eyes we're actually following Rosie's brother, so what is his name? Weston Belmont, that's Rosie's brother. He kind of works on this ranch. He has horses and he kind of trains horses and things like that. And then we have a pretty famous Canadian country singer who ends up coming to work with Ford at his record label. They meet, have a bit of a meet cute. The story kind of goes from there. There's not too much you kind of need to know from that. Now, Weston actually has some children from a previous relationship, so again, single dad tropes in there. I ended up rating this one 3.5 only because I do think the romance was a bit more forced in this story. I didn't really feel the chemistry with these two as much as I did with Ford and Rosie in White Love. Felt a little bit more insta-lovey, definitely felt a little bit more cliche than the first book. So again, I do think if you're looking for a nice fluffy romance that you just want to kind of escape with, it's definitely still a good story. I really like Elsie Silver's character work, the banter between the characters. I like the setting and I like kind of the story that she's building around the characters, but in terms of the couple within this one, I wasn't fully invested, and I think that's obviously a pretty big thing when you're reading a romance. You need to be invested in the relationship, and for whatever reason I just didn't click with it. It didn't feel as authentic as it did with White Love. So interested to see how Wilde's Side goes, which I think is actually out today which is the 4th of March when I'm filming this, so I think that third book is out now, so I'll be interested to see how that goes because I know the characters that it will be following and we have kind of got glimpses of them within these stories, so I'll be really interested to see how that one plays out. But yeah, I think for both of these, if I'm kind of wrapping them up together, really great fluffy romances. There was a bit of a story in there in terms of, you know, self-discovery and things like that with both of them, to be fair, but they're definitely not anything as good as the Chestnut Spring series for me personally. Not yet, but we've still got another couple of books within this series to go. Okay, so next up I ended up picking up Kingdom of the Wicked. So this is one of my 25 for 2025. I really wanted to get this series started because it's one that I've had on my list for quite some time. And in this one we're following Amelia, who at the start of the book has a twin called Vittoria who ends up getting murdered, and the story is basically following Amelia while she tries to figure out who murdered her sister and basically get revenge for that. Along the way she ends up kind of dabbling in some dark magic and enlisting the help of a prince of hell who is called Wrath, and they end up working together to try and solve a series of murders that are happening to women across the town, and the story kind of goes from there. And I think with this one I liked it but I didn't love it. I think I would have liked a lot more development of the world that they were living in, because even though it was mentioned where they were, I don't think I had a really good view of the setting, the time period or anything like that. So I know it was kind of set in an Italian kind of setting, but for me it wasn't really that rich in terms of the world building, so I think that did take me out of the story a little bit. We did get to see a couple of the Princes of Hell, and for me they all kind of felt like a carbon copy of each other. You know, if I didn't know who it was in a scene, I wouldn't have been able to kind of tell them apart by their personality or by how they were speaking with the main character. They all did kind of feel like a carbon copy of each other, which I'm hoping we get a bit more of a distinction from them in the rest of the series, because there are 2 more books within this series, and I know that some of the Princes of Hell get their own books, so I'm hoping they are going to be a bit more distinctive as I go through the rest of the story. But yeah, In terms of the first book, I just didn't really feel that distinction between them. Just notice it's going really dark. Let me just try and brighten it up a bit. Not sure if that's helping at all. Which was a really bad time to film this. It is kind of the evening. Let me just double check if my light will help. But yeah, I think it was an interesting concept. I'm really intrigued with how the first book ended, so I will probably continue this series. It's probably not a priority for me right now, just after reading that first book, but as I say, I'm interested enough that I probably will continue with the series, but overall I ended up giving this one 3.5. Then next up I read Rebel Witch by Kristen Cicerelli, and this is the sequel to Crimson Moth or Heartless Hunter, depending on where you are in the world. This is one of my most anticipated releases for this year. I couldn't wait to read this one, and it definitely didn't disappoint. If you haven't heard of the Crimson Moth, it basically follows these two characters. One is a witch and one is a witch hunter. We're living in this world where witches have been basically outcast. There was a revolution, they used to rule, they were overthrown, and basically any witches that are found are either imprisoned or killed. But there is this vigilante called the Crimson Moth who is working to try and help any witches within this land escape, and that Crimson Moth happens to be our main character, Rune Winters. Now she is kind of passing herself off as a socialite and pretending to be a bit of an airhead to try and get some intel on witches that have been captured and things like that, and as part of that ploy she ends up kind of fake dating the head of Witch Hunter Guard called Gideon Sharp, and that's kind of where the first book takes off, and we were given quite a huge cliffhanger at the end of book one, so I was really highly anticipating this book, and I do think that it kind of gave us more of the same as what we got in book one. There was great pacing, there was definitely still that element of enemies to lovers, and it was just such a fun journey with them, and it really kept you on your toes with these two. I did think the start of it was a little bit repetitive, so it didn't quite hit that 5-star mark for me because of that. There was quite a few cyclical kind of scenes that happened, so it did feel a little bit repetitive, but I do think overall I still really enjoyed it, and I absolutely loved how the duology ended. So if you do like any stories about kind of witches, witch hunters, or if you're looking for a good kind of almost entry-level fantasy series, I think this would be a great one. Firstly because it's a duology, but secondly because I don't think that the world and the magic system is too convoluted, so it would be a great one to kind of start looking into fantasy, and if you're trying to start within that genre, I definitely think this duology would be one to check out. So yeah, I think overall the series is probably like a 4 to 4.5 series for me, but really fun, really great writing, really great pacing, and one that I highly recommend. Sorry if the lighting and the angles kind of changed, I did just have to fix that because it was getting really dark. I've just had one of those days, you know, where things just don't go right, so this is just topping it off, but hopefully it looks okay. Hopefully in editing I can make it look a little bit more streamlined, but just in case it looks a bit different, that's why. And then next up I read the first book that I've read for my In Real Life book club, which is actually meeting next week, and I'm really excited about it. So chapter 25, they do kind of these book clubs across the UK, and I decided to sign up for one in Belfast, and our first meeting is next week. And the first book that we read was Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Fan Pelt, and I must say this isn't a book I probably would have picked up on my own. I don't think it's one that I would have really gravitated towards. It's basically following a lot of these different characters within this town. So we've got an older woman who basically her son died when he was quite young. There's a bit of a mystery surrounding his death, and she's never really moved on from it. She's cleaning at an aquarium, and one of the characters and point of views that we get is actually one of the octopus within the aquarium. So again, bit of an outlandish synopsis, but we do get a point of view from that character as well. And the octopus and the old lady end up kind of forging this friendship, and he is actually trying to help her uncover the mystery around her son's death. And for this one I definitely think it's a bit of a cozy fiction kind of story, definitely a bit of a character study. In terms of the pacing and things like that, it is pretty slow, so if you're not really a literary fiction person, I'm not sure if this is one that you would enjoy, but I am glad that it was the pick for our book club because I ended up really enjoying it. And as I say, it wasn't one that I would have probably picked up of my own accord, but I ended up really enjoying it for what it was. It took me a little while to get into just because it is very character based, and as I say, I was going through a bit of a slump, so probably needed something that was a bit faster paced to kind of keep me out of that slump, but I was still really enjoying the character development and kind of following their stories along, wondering how they would kind of intertwine, because we do follow quite a few different characters within this small town, and by the end of it obviously their stories converge and there are some connections that to be made there. So after about the 30% mark I was definitely really intrigued to see where these characters would be going and how they would be connected. I did kind of guess there is a bit of a twist at the end, and I did kind of guess it quite early on, but it didn't take away from my enjoyment. I still really enjoyed the story and how we got there, and I actually really loved the point of view from the octopus who is called Marcellus. And if you've read it or if you've listened to the audiobook, you'll definitely agree that there is going to be a film adaptation for this one, and if they don't cast Kelsey Grammer for that, I don't know what they're doing, because it just perfectly encompasses kind of his personality. So be interested to see the film adaptation and see how it compares. But I think if you're looking for a relatively short, cozy literature fiction story to read, I definitely recommend this one because I did enjoy it. I rated it 4 stars. It's probably between a 3.5 and a 4 in reality, but for the most part I did really enjoy it. It had me giggling, I was intrigued enough to finish it, and yeah, glad it was something that I ended up picking up. So next up, because I was in my slump, I decided to try and just continue series that I was in the middle of. And one of the books that I wanted to pick up was Faves and Ruins by Helen Shearer, and this is the second book in the Legends of Theasmar series. So in the first book we're following Thea, who is kind of training to become what's called a war sword. But within this land, women basically aren't allowed to be warriors, and she's not supposed to be allowed to enter the trials to become one. Several things happen that mean that she is able to participate within these trials and ends up getting inducted in this academy to train to become a war sword. And as part of that, she ends up getting a mentor called Wilde Hawthorne, and the story kind of goes from there. You can probably guess what happens between those two. And the first book, I enjoyed it. It was a little bit mid for me. Again, with the romance in it, I thought it was pretty fast paced. I thought there was a little bit of insta love there, and I did enjoy kind of the character development with it, but I just would have liked more of it when I was reading it. So didn't absolutely love the first book, but wanted to read on because I know so many people really love this series. So decided to read on in this book, and I will say there was a lot of filler in this book and a lot of spice basically, and there wasn't really much else than that when I was reading it, and I felt a little bit repetitive as we were going through, you know, again just filler scenes, spice scene, filler scene, spice scene, and I felt for the first kind of 80% of it we didn't really get anything added to the narrative. It was just kind of the two characters gravitating towards each other, then saying why they couldn't be together. That would happen again and again, and it did feel a little bit repetitive for me. The last 20% was pretty intriguing. There was a bit of a twist there that has me, as always with these books, intrigued to see what happens as the story goes on. So I probably will read the third book. I can get the audiobook on Everand, so I probably will listen to it that way and see where the story goes, but not loving this series at the minute, which is quite disappointing because I did think it was going to be kind of a new 5-star series for me, but so far it's definitely sitting at like the 3.5 overall. So not terrible, you know, these aren't terrible books or anything, but just not the type of romantasy that I personally enjoy. So we'll see how the third book goes. It'll probably be make or break for me whether I continue the series, but as there's only 4 books I'll probably just end up finishing it. Yeah, a little bit disappointed with that one, but I suppose just to mention I was in a slump, so maybe take what I say with a pinch of salt. And then the last book I read that was a new read, so I did do one reread which I will briefly mention at the end, but the last book that I read was Emily Wilde's Compendium of Lost Tales, and again was a highly anticipated release for me. I've loved that series. It's a really cozy fantasy series. In the first book we're following Emily Wilde, who is basically trying to put together this encyclopedia of all the different fur folk, and in order to do that she kind of travels to the north of Norway to do a bit of research on the fur folk around there. And while she's there, one of her colleagues, Wendell Bumblebee, kind of comes and tries to, as she perceives it, take over her research. She thinks he's trying to take credit for her work, and the story kind of goes from there. But just a really fun, cozy fantasy. There's a lot of kind of traditional folklore within there, so the depiction of the Fae is much more traditional. Definitely the type of Fae story that I would have grew up with, and not kind of the Fae that we're used to being depicted within romantasy these days. So I really love that aspect of it, and it definitely does give it a point of difference within kind of the fantasy realm these days. But for me, I just really love the characters within here. Emily is kind of characterized as quite standoffish. She's quite awkward. She's not really a people person, and I can really resonate with her, and I don't know what that says about me, but I definitely resonate with her character. Whereas we have Wendell, who is very charismatic, you know, everyone loves him. He's much more extroverted, and just kind of seeing their interactions is always really fun, and I really love the banter between them. This was the third book in the series, so obviously I can't go into too much detail about this book, but it was definitely more fairy tale-esque. We definitely got more into that kind of Fae folklore that has been explored within the first 2 books, but we definitely feel more in it, if that makes sense, without giving anything away. I loved how some of the stories that Emily was referencing were kind of interwoven within the narrative, and it kind of helped play out the story as we went along. And as I say, the dynamic between Emily and Wendell, as always, was top tier, really fun to read, and I do think that it's been kind of left open where new stories within this world could be written, so kind of hoping there's going to be a few novellas or something like that written within this world, because they're always just so comforting and cozy, and I just really love this series. So yeah, if you haven't read this series, I definitely recommend picking it up. It's not complete, so you can kind of binge them all. They're usually really fast reads, so you have kind of a rainy afternoon and you just want to pick up something that's going to be really cozy and comforting. Definitely recommend this series. Then as I say, the last book that I wanted to talk about is a reread. It was House of Scam Breath by Sarah J Maas. I mentioned this in pretty much every wrap up recently, but I am doing a reread of her entire backlog, so we only had one more book to read, which I've actually already read at this point, but I hadn't finished it in February, so that's why it's not included in the list. list. But yeah, Red House of Sky and Breath. Now with this one, I always rate this around a 4-star. The second book in that series is very slow. There's a lot of filler within that book, and every time I reread, it doesn't kind of change my perception. Most of the other SJM books that I read, I end up loving them more the second time I read them, but for this one, apart from the last kind of 5%, quite honestly, the rest of it feels pretty slow and pretty info dumpy, so probably my least favourite of the Crescent City series, but still a really fun reread nonetheless. So yeah, that's everything. That's all the books I read in February. As I say, I did kind of slump for most of the month, but when I look at my reads and look at kind of my ratings for most of them, I did actually end up having a pretty good month, even though it felt like I was having a pretty bad reading month after that kind of halfway point. And there were a few firm favourites that I found in there, so I think a win overall. Let me know what you read in February and what your favourite read was, and if there's any books that I should be adding to my TBR. I'd love to know what you've been reading and your thoughts and feelings on them, and any new firm favourites that I should be adding to my list. If you like this video, do remember to give it a like, and if you want to see more from me, remember to subscribe. I post 2 videos per week, and it's videos like this, so wrap-ups, TBR jars, reading vlogs, come shopping with me, book hauls, all good bookish things like that. Other than that, thanks so much for watching this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one soon. Bye!